The chapel of Carlow Abbey was full of candles, and every candle was wrong. Rowena stood at the back of the nave in a borrowed grey mantle, her hood drawn close against the November cold. She had walked through to reach this door, and she watched a woman who was not her stand at the altar in a gown the color of new cream. The bride's gloved hand rested in a hand. Rowena knew better than her own. She had held that hand at a graveside 2 winters past. She had felt it tremble once in a carriage outside a London ballroom when she had told him she was not afraid of him, though everyone said she ought to be. Now it held another woman's fingers. As the vicar spoke the words that would unmake her, and the candlelight slid down the navy of the Duke's coat, as though the room itself were trying to remember him for her, nobody had turned. 200 guests, and not one of them felt the door open at their backs. The cold came in with her and touched the nearest necks, and was mistaken for a draught. She had rehearsed this walk for 11 days. She had imagined herself crossing the stone floor with her chin level and her name on her lips, the long aisle parting before the simple fact of her face. She had not imagined her own legs failing her at the threshold. She had not imagined that the first thing she would feel, seeing him alive and well and about to be lost, would not be triumph or fury, but a grief so complete, it stopped her breath. The vicar asked the question that always comes: whether any present knew of a cause or just impediment. The silence in the chapel was the silence of a room that has decided nothing can go wrong. Rowena pushed back her hood. Let me bring you back 2 years and a little more to the morning. Everything in this story was decided. Because the woman at that door did not arrive from nowhere, and the man at that altar was not the fool. He would look that night. She had been Rowena Briscoe before she was anything else, the daughter of a Devon clergyman with a good library and a poor living, and she had married the Duke of Carlow in the spring of her 24th year, against the loud advice of nearly everyone who advised him. It was not a love match in the way the season understood love matches. There had been no dancing card courtship, no whispered campaign across a ballroom. There had been instead a long argument about a drainage scheme on the Abbey's eastern fields, conducted over 3 afternoons in his steward's office, at the end of which the Duke had looked at her differently and said, in his level way, that he had never been corrected so thoroughly by anyone who was also right. She had laughed. He had not. That was the whole of it, and it was enough to the county. She was a misalliance. A clergyman's daughter, with ink on her fingers, and opinions she did not trouble to soften, set down in the great cold rooms of an abbey that had held duchesses with 3 counties in their dowries. The county had decided what she was before she unpacked her trunks. He has married his land agent, Mr. Bertram Glasscock said, the first week to a card table that laughed. He said it low, as one shares a private joke, his rings catching the candle as he dealt. He was her cousin on her mother's side, a smooth, well-fed man of 40, who managed the Abbey's accounts and had managed them for the old Duke before, and he had come to the wedding wearing the expression of a man calculating a sum he did not like. A clever creature, I grant you, but you do not put a clever creature where a duchess belongs and expect the house to stand, Rowena had heard him. She was meant to. She had said nothing, only filed the sentence away in the orderly place where she kept things that would matter later. She did not yet know how much it would matter. What she did not yet know was that the man who managed her husband's money had already begun that same week to manage her out of the story altogether. She made herself useful in the way she knew, which was the only kind of usefulness she trusted. She learned the Abbey. She learned its tenants by name and its rent rolls by heart. She found the leak in the long gallery roof that 3 stewards had missed. She sat through the dull tide tables of the coast estate because the Abbey's wealth came partly from a small fleet of trading vessels working out of the cove below the cliffs. And a duchess who did not understand where the money came from could not protect the people who depended on it. Tristan watched her do all this with a stillness she learned slowly to read. He was not a cold man. He was a careful one, widowed once before her by a marriage of duty. He never spoke of, and he kept his warmth the way a frugal house keeps its fire, banked low and fed only where it was needed. When he wished her to rest, he did not say so. He said, "Sit down, Rowena. You have been standing since 6. She heard the command and learned, over months, to hear the care underneath it. By their first autumn together, she had stopped being afraid she was a misalliance. She had begun very quietly to be happy. That is the dangerous condition in any story. Happiness leaves a person facing the wrong direction. In the October of their second year, she went down to the cove. There had been a dispute about the trading vessels, a question of a captain's accounting that did not add up, and Rowena had insisted on going herself, rather than sending a clerk, because she had grown suspicious of clerks, and of one clerk in particular, whose figures were always tidy in the way that hid more than mess ever could. She took the small, fast cutter that carried the Abbey's correspondence down the coast, to the agent at Verion. The morning was fair when she left. By afternoon, the sky off the headland had turned the color of a bruise, and a squall came up out of the southwest with a suddenness those waters are known for, and the cutter that had carried her 100 safe miles was driven unto the teeth below Bramber Point and broke apart in the dark. That is the wreck the county mourned. A duchess drowned within sight of her own cliffs, her body taken by a sea that gave back 2 crewmen and a length of painted rail, and nothing else. They held a service for her in the chapel where she now stood in a grey mantle. Tristan had ordered a stone cut. He had not been able to speak the words "a husband is meant to speak" over it, and the county had forgiven him that, because grief in a duke is permitted to be silent. The sea had not taken her. A fishing family out of a Cornish village, 3 coves west, had pulled a half-drowned woman from the surf at first light, and the woman they pulled out could not for many days say who she was. The cold and the blow to her head when the deck split had taken her name from her mouth, and most of her memory with it. The fisherman's wife, a sharp, kind woman named Maud Halliday, took her in and called her Anne for lack of anything better, and put her to mending nets, and then to mending shirts, and then, when it became plain that the half-drowned stranger could embroider a cuff finer than anything sold in Truro, to taking in fine sewing for the gentry up the valley. For the better part of a year, Rowena Briscoe lived as Anne the Needlewoman, and stitched other women's wedding linens, and did not know she had a husband mourning her 40 miles up the coast. I will not pretend the memory came back all at once the way it does in the cheaper sort of story, with a thunderclap and a name cried out. It came back the way the tide comes in over flat sand, in long reaches that withdrew and returned a little higher, a pattern of leaded windows in a dream. The word entail surfacing in her mouth one morning, over the washtub, with a weight she could not account for, the smell of beeswax and old books. And one evening, threading a needle by a tallow candle, the sudden whole and terrible knowledge of a man's voice saying, "Sit down, Rowena, you have been standing since 6, and the knowing, all at once, of exactly who she was, and exactly what she had lost. It took her another month to be strong enough to walk, and to gather, from the careful question she put to Maud, and to the carrier who came up the valley with the Truro papers, the shape of what had happened in her absence. What she gathered turned the ground under her. The Duke of Carlow, the papers said, was to be married. The banns had been read. The wedding was set for the eve of St. Catherine's, at Carlow Abbey, the bride a Miss Sidonie Pruitt, niece of the Abbey's man of business, who had so steadied his lordship in his long grief. A marriage of great suitability, the notice said. A union of 2 families already joined in the management of one of the finest estates in the West Country. Rowena read that notice 4 times by Maud Halliday's fire, and the 4th time she understood it was not grief that had arranged this wedding. It was arithmetic. Here is the arithmetic, because you should understand it, as she came to, sitting very still while the fire spat. When she had married the Duke, her settlement had been drawn so that a portion of the Abbey's coastal trade, the vessels and the cove, and the agent's lease at Verion passed into her separate keeping for her lifetime, to do with as a duchess ought, which in her case had meant beginning to do with it rather too cleverly for one man's comfort. A duchess who learned the books was a duchess who would in time find the soft, tidy places in them. Her cousin had seen that coming. The first week, he had set it at a card table while he dealt, and then the sea had handed him a gift. A drowned duchess, a grief-stricken duke. N. A year of silence in which a careful man could have her death, declared certain and proven, could draw her settlement back into the estate he controlled, and could place at the Duke's elbow a soft, pretty, biddable niece who would sign where she was told, and never once read the figures. With Rowena gone, he had lost a watcher. With Sidonia installed, he would gain a duchess of his own making. She did not weep over it. She had wept already, for the husband, she thought, had forgotten her too easily, before she understood he had been lied to by the one man he trusted with everything. The understanding cooled her grief into something harder and far more useful. She did not need his pity. She needed her name back, and she needed it back in the one place it had been taken from her, in front of the same county that had buried her. And she needed it back in a way that did not depend on the Duke believing a poor needlewoman over the signed and sealed certainty of his own man of business, for Glasscock would not simply fold. She knew her cousin. A man who has forged a death does not blanch when the dead walk in. He guards what he has built. He had a declaration of death sworn before a magistrate. He had the 2 surviving crewmen's depositions, and Rowena was certain, knowing how he worked, that he had taken the precaution of making those crewmen unavailable to contradict him, paid off, and shipped out on a Bristol vessel where no one would think to look. He would meet her, not with shock, but with sorrow. He would call her a poor, mad creature, a stranger driven by grief or greed to claim a great lady's name. And he would do it gently, in front of 200 people, and the gentleness would be the knife. She had heard him be gentle. It was his most dangerous register. So she did not come empty-handed, and she did not come trusting to luck, and she did not come hoping to be recognized. She came to prove a thing. She had 3 things. The first was small and lived against her skin. A miniature of her own face, painted the spring of her marriage, that she had been wearing on a ribbon under her bodice the day the cutter broke, and that the sea, for once merciful, had let her keep. The second was knowledge no impostor could have, the interior knowledge of the Abbey and its books and its people, the leak in the long gallery roof and the captain's false accounting and the precise terms of her own settlement, things Glasscock himself had buried and could not afford to have spoken aloud. And the third, the one she had spent 11 days, and the last of Maud Halliday's small savings to obtain, was a sheet of paper she carried sewn flat into the lining of the borrowed mantle, so that no pickpocket and no servant-turned-spy could find it. For Rowena, before she ever sailed, had done one careful thing that her cousin did not know she had done. Suspicious of the captain's figures, she had written in her own hand to the harbour master at Verion and to the underwriter in Bristol, who insured the Abbey's hulls, asking each for a true copy of the cutter's manifest and her own letter of authority to sail that day. The replies had come back to the Abbey after the wreck, addressed to a dead woman. And a dead woman's letters are opened by her man of business. Glasscock had read them. He had also, being thorough, kept them, because a careful man does not burn paper he might one day need to know the contents of. They sat in his locked cabinet at the Abbey to this hour. The underwriter in Bristol, however, had, in the ordinary way of his trade, retained the office copy of his own reply, and to that office Rowena had walked. And from that clerk, with the miniature as her bond, and a promise of the Duke's name behind her, she had obtained a certified true copy under the underwriter's seal, dated and witnessed, bearing the manifest of the cutter and, beneath it, in her own unmistakable hand, the letter of authority she had written the week before she drowned. A signature is a difficult thing to forge twice the same. Glasscock had a death sworn before a magistrate. Rowena had sewn against her ribs a document of her own making that no one but the living woman who wrote it could have produced, and a sealed certification from a disinterested house in Bristol that the hand was the hand of the Duchess of Carlow. That was the impediment she carried into the chapel. Now you know it, as she knew it, and we can return to the candles. She pushed back her hood, and the cold that had come in with her finally found a throat to climb. A woman near the door saw her first, and made a sound that was not a word. Then the next, and the next, the way a single drop stitch runs the length of a stocking, until 200 heads were turning, and the warm hum of the chapel cracked into a silence so total Rowena could hear the candle flames lean. At the altar, Miss Sidonie Pruitt turned last, because a bride watches the vicar, and her face when she saw the woman at the door was not triumph and not cunning. It was the blank white shock of a young person who has just understood that something she was told was simple is not. She had been told. Rowena would learn only that she was marrying a sad grand widower and pleasing her uncle by it. She had not been told whose place she stood in. Her gloved hand opened, and the Duke's hand was suddenly holding nothing. Tristan turned. The whole long story of 2 years stood in the space between the altar and the door, and across it, a man looked at a face he had cut into stone and set in the floor of this very church. He did not cry out her name. That was not in him, and she would not have known him if he had. He went the color of the cravat at his throat. His hand, the hand that had just lost a bride's fingers, rose halfway from his side, and stopped, as though he had reached for something in the dark and remembered there was nothing there. And he said, in a voice gone down to nearly nothing, in front of 200 people, and the woman he had been about to marry, a single word: Rowena. She had not heard her own name in his voice for 2 years. It nearly finished her. She put her hand against the cold stone of the doorframe and held on, and did not let her face show the county anything. It had not earned. Then Bertram Glasscock stepped out of the front pew. He moved smoothly the way a man moves who is prepared for this, because he had prepared for everything, and his face had already arranged itself into the gentle sorrow she had known it would wear. He came down the aisle with his hands a little open, palms up, a man approaching a frightened animal. And he spoke not to her, but to the room, in the carrying, kindly voice of a steward managing a crisis. "Gently, gently. Let no one be alarmed." He had a handkerchief out, dabbing nothing. "Your Grace, I beg you do not. This is the cruelty I feared. There are creatures who read of a great lady's death in the papers, and are unbalanced by it. We have had 2 such letters already this month, poor souls. I had hoped to spare you this on such a day." He turned then to Rowena, and his face was a mask of pity laid over the calculation she had watched him do at a card table 2 years before. "Child, I do not know what grief or want has brought you to this, and I am sorry for it. Truly I am. But you must see how cruel it is. The Duchess of Carlow lies under the stone you are standing beside. I drew the certificate of her death myself. Come away now, and let us see you fed and looked after." And no more will be said. It was beautifully done. She granted him that. Even then, he had not denied her loudly, which a guilty man does. He had pitied her gently, which a kind man does. And half the room exhaled, and began, already, to believe him, because it is so much easier to believe a sad madwoman than a returned wife, and because 200 people in their best clothes did not want a wedding turned into a wreck. She felt the room tilting back toward him. She let it. She had counted on it. "You drew the certificate of her death yourself," Rowena said. Her voice came out steadier than she had dared hope, the clergyman's daughter voice that carried to the back of a cold church without seeming to rise. "Yes, I imagine you did, cousin. You have always been thorough with paper." The word cousin moved through the chapel like a draught of its own. "I am called Anne now," she went on, to the room, not to him, because she had learned that a person defending herself looks weak, and a person stating facts looks like the truth. "A fishing family 3 coves west of Bramber Point pulled me out of the sea the morning after the Abbey's cutter broke up, and for the better part of a year I did not know my own name, and I have the marks of it still, here, above the ear, where the deck took me." She did not touch the scar. She let them imagine it. "I will not ask you to believe a woman's face, sir, though there are those here who knew mine. Faces lie, and grief makes liars of the eye. I will ask you to believe paper, since you set such store by it." Glasscock's gentle expression did not change. Yet Rowena had spent a year of her marriage learning to read the small, still language of careful men, and she saw the thing she was watching for. The half-beat of stillness too long, the dab of the handkerchief that paused. He had not known about the paper. 2 years ago, she said, before ever I sailed, I grew uneasy about the accounting of the Abbey's vessels, and I wrote, in my own hand, to the harbour master at Ferrion, and to the underwriter who insures the Abbey's hulls in Bristol, asking each for a true copy of the cutter's manifest, and of my own letter of authority to sail. Those replies came back to the Abbey after I was drowned. They were opened in the ordinary way by the Abbey's man of business. She let that sit. They are in his cabinet still. He will tell you he has never seen them. He is welcome to send for the key. She did not wait for him to answer that, because the trap of asking a liar a question is that he is given time to lie. She drew the folded sheet from the slit she had cut in the mantle's lining, and she held it up, and the underwriter's red seal caught the candlelight so that even the back pews could see there was wax on it. This is the office copy of the underwriter's reply. Certified true under his seal in Bristol 9 days ago, witnessed and dated. It carries the manifest of the cutter that drowned the Duchess of Carlow. And it carries beneath it the letter I wrote in my own hand the week before I sailed. She turned now from the room to the man, and let the pity she had been keeping out of her voice come into it, because the cruelest thing she could do to him was to be kind. You kept the originals, Bertram. Of course you did. A careful man does not burn paper. He may need send for them. And lay my hand beside my hand, and let any clerk in this county tell us whether one woman wrote them both. The silence after that had a different quality. It was the silence of 200 people who have stopped wanting a wedding and started wanting the truth. Glasscock's defense did not collapse. I want you to mark that, because a lesser man's would have, and the story would have been the poorer and the less true. He had built carefully for years, and he did not abandon the building, because one wall was struck. He turned to the magistrate seated in the second pew, old Sir Cora Lockton, who had sworn the death, and he spread his hands wider. Sir Cora, you swore the certificate. You will not see a great house overturned on the word of a wandering woman, and a paper got up in Bristol by anyone with a guinea. His voice hardened, just slightly, into the register of a man invoking the order he served. There are 2 crewmen who deposed they saw her grace go down. Their sworn word stands against this. Sworn word before a magistrate, against a sealed paper that proves only that a letter once existed. I will have the constable see this woman safely housed and examined by a physician, and we will none of us let a holy day be made a circus. He had already half turned to summon the man at the door. It was, Rowena saw, a good move. It removed her from the room before the paper could be tested, and gave him a week to make the underwriter's clerk unavailable too. The 2 crewmen, Rowena said, are aboard the brig Wenna out of Bristol, bound for the Indies, paid £11 apiece to be at sea when I came home. You will not produce them this side of spring. You did not expect to need to. She had not known that for certain. She had guessed it, from the shape of how he worked, and she watched the guess land on his face and stick, and she knew she had guessed right, and so did everyone who was watching his face instead of hers. Then Tristan moved. He had stood through all of it without speaking, and a duke's silence in his own chapel is a loud thing, and the room had been waiting for it the way a field waits for weather. He came down from the altar step. He did not go to Rowena. He went instead to his cousin and steward, the man who had managed his money and his grief, and very nearly his second marriage, and he stopped in front of him close enough that the words did not need to carry, though in that silence they carried anyway. You drew her death certificate yourself, Tristan said. It was not a question. You told me there was nothing of her recovered. You told me her letters in the months before were the ordinary letters of an estate, and you brought them to me, opened, and you read me only what you chose. You sat at my table through 2 winters and let me cut her name into stone. His voice did not rise. It went, if anything, lower and more level, and Rowena thought that of everything that happened in that chapel it was the most frightening sound in it, because she had heard it before, banked low and fed only where it was needed, and she knew what it cost him to keep it level. Send for the cabinet, Bertram, now. I will have the key off you here, or I will have Sir Cora's constable take it off you, but the cabinet will be opened in this church within the hour, and we will lay the hand against the hand. That was the minimum sufficient thing, and he did not say a word past it. He did not strike his cousin, nor name him a forger to the room, nor crush the white-faced bride who stood forgotten at the altar. He claimed his wife by claiming her hand on a page, and he set the matter where it could only be settled by truth, and then he stopped. Glasscock looked at the Duke, and at the sealed paper, and at the magistrate who was no longer comfortable, and at the 200 faces that had been his audience and were now his jury. And Rowena saw the exact moment the arithmetic he lived by failed him. He had built his whole defense on the fact that the dead do not write. The one woman alive who could lay her own hand beside the hand he had sworn was dead was standing in the aisle, with a sealed copy of it, and he could not make her drown twice. He did not confess. Men like him rarely do. He said, with the handkerchief still in his hand and his voice gone thin, "This is monstrous. I have served this house 30 years. And those were the last words Bertram Glasscock spoke at Carlow Abbey, because they were the words of a guilty man at last, and every soul in the chapel heard the difference. The cabinet was opened that hour. Sir Cora Lockton, who did not enjoy having sworn a false certificate, and was a just enough man to want it undone publicly, sent his own clerk with the constable, and the locked cabinet in the steward's office gave up the harbour-master's reply and the underwriter's reply, both addressed to a dead duchess. The clerk laid the letter of authority from the cabinet beside the certified copy from Rowena's mantle, there on the chancel step where the wedding party should have been signing a register, and any fool could see the two letters were written by one hand, the same long looped capitals, the same Devon clergyman's daughter's economy with ink, and when the harbour-master's manifest was read against the certificate of death, the dates did not agree, because a man forging the certain death of a living woman had been careless about a tide table he never thought anyone would check, and Rowena, who had sat through every dull tide table on that coast, had checked. It was her knowledge, in the end, and not her face, that brought her home. The county had buried a clever creature it never quite accepted, and it took her back because she proved, on paper, in front of all of them, that she was cleverer than the man who had buried her. There was a justice in that. The season understood, even if it was not the justice of a kinder world. Sir Cora took Glasscock into the custody of the law that evening, on the strength of his own undone oath, and the matter of the forged death, and the suppressed letters and the £11 apiece, passed out of the chapel and into the slow grinding courts, where it belongs, and where I will leave it. It is the story of a woman's return, and the man whose seeing of her was the only verdict that ever truly mattered to her. Miss Sidonie Pruitt, I should tell you, behaved better than her uncle deserved. She had stood at the altar in her cream gown through the whole of it, forgotten, and when the chapel began to empty, she crossed to Rowena, white-faced still, and made her a small correct curtsy and said in a low, steady voice that did her more credit than the marriage would have, "Your Grace, I did not know whose place I stood in. I am glad you came before, and not after." And Rowena, who had no quarrel with the girl, and saw plainly that she had been a piece moved on the board, and not the hand that moved her, took her cold-gloved fingers a moment and said only, "Then you are the better for it, and so am I." That was the whole of their reckoning, and it was enough, and Sidonie Pruitt went out of the Abbey with her dignity, which was more than she had come in with. The chapel emptied slowly, the way a great room does when something has happened in it that the people inside will be telling for 30 years. And then the candles were guttering, and the cold had crept back in through the open door, and the Duke of Carlow and his Duchess were alone in the nave where 2 hours before he had been about to marry someone else, and neither of them had yet said one private word to the other. He crossed the stone floor. He had crossed it that night already, to confront the man who had wronged them both, and now he crossed it again, and the distance was the same distance, and it was nothing like the same. "You wrote to Bristol," he said. His voice was not level now. "Before you ever sailed, you suspected, and you wrote, and you kept the proof of your own hand alive in an office 40 miles away without knowing you would ever need it." He stopped close to her the way he used to stop close to her, and he looked at the small scar above her ear that she had told the room about, and never touched, and his careful banked warmth came up all at once like a fire fed at last in a cold house. You came back, and you did not trust me to know you. You came armed with paper because you knew I might not. It was not an accusation. It was the nearest thing to grief she had heard from him. I cut your name into the floor of this church with my own decision, and I could not say the words over it. They thought I was too grieved to speak. I was not grieved. I did not believe it. I stood at that stone 100 times, and I did not believe it. And I let a man I trusted tell me I was mad to doubt a certificate, and I married where he pointed me because I had stopped trusting my own knowing. You believed it enough to read the banns, she said. She had not meant it to come out so quietly. I believed nothing enough, he said. That is the worst thing. I let myself be managed. His hand came up, the same hand, and stopped a breath from her cold cheek, and waited there, asking, the way he had always asked her without words. Tell me, to my face, that you are her. Not on paper. I have had enough of paper from men who lied to me. Tell me, and I will know. And Rowena, who had walked into this church armed against everyone, who had armed herself precisely because she could not bear to stake her whole life on a man's faith and lose, found that the armor was no use to her at all in the one moment she had wanted it most, and was glad. She turned her cold cheek the last breath into his waiting hand. I am Rowena, she said. I corrected you about the eastern drainage in your steward's office over 3 afternoons, and you said you had never been corrected so thoroughly by anyone who was also right. And I laughed, and you did not, and I have thought of it every day for 2 years in a fishing cottage, where they called me. I am your wife. Sit down, Tristan. You have been standing since the banns. He made a sound she had never heard him make, half a laugh and half the thing a man does, instead of weeping, and he did not sit down. He drew her in against the navy coat that had been married in that night, and he held her the way he had held nothing for 2 years. And over his shoulder she could see, through the chapel door, the dark line of the cliffs and the cove below them where the sea had taken her and, in its slow way, given her back. They did not marry again. There was no need. And Tristan would not have it. A man does not marry his wife twice, he said, as though the suggestion offended him, and Rowena loved him for the plainness of it. The stone in the chapel floor with her name on it was taken up that winter, quietly, with no ceremony, by the same mason who had cut it, and the gap it left was floored over clean, and for the rest of their lives there was a place in the nave where the stones did not quite match, and they both knew which place it was, and both of them looked at it every Sunday. She went back, in the spring, to the cove, 3 coves west of Bramber Point, and she found Maud Halliday mending nets in the same doorway, and she did not arrive as a duchess with a carriage and a condescension. She arrived as Anne in a plain gown, with the last of a debt to pay, and a great deal more besides, and she sat in the doorway and threaded a needle and mended a shirt cuff beside the woman who had pulled her out of the sea. And only when the work was done did she say what she had come to say, which was that the Hallidays would want for nothing again as long as Carlow Abbey stood, and that she had named their youngest, who had been born the winter Anne was washed up, in her own household accounts, as a charge upon the estate for life. Maud Halliday, who was a sharp, kind woman and did not weep easily, said only, I always thought you sewed too fine for a drowned woman, and went back to her nets, and that was their reckoning, and it, too, was enough. And so the years came on, as they do. The Abbey's books were kept, after that by a steward. Rowena chose herself and watched closely, and the soft, tidy places in the accounts were found and mended one by one, and the tenants learned that the Duchess knew their names and their leeks, and the true price of their corn. The county, which had buried a clever creature, found it had got back a great lady, and could not for the life of it remember having objected to her, the way a county never can. The drainage on the eastern fields was finished. The leak in the long gallery was mended. The little fleet of trading vessels worked the coast under honest accounting, and twice a year the Duchess of Carlow went down to the cove herself to see the books of it, and stood on the cliff above Bramber Point in the wind, and was not afraid of the sea, because the sea had already done its worst and been overruled. There is one more small thing, and then I will let you go. For you have stayed a long while in this cold church, and I am grateful for it." On the night she came back, before all the rest of it, when she had drawn the folded paper from the lining of the borrowed mantle, she had cut the lining with her own scissors. Days before, in Maud Halliday's cottage, and Maud had watched her do it, and clicked her tongue and said it was a shame to ruin good wool. Rowena had kept the scissors. They were a small worn pair, the steel gone thin at the points from a year of fine sewing. The only thing she owned that had been wholly hers in the drowned year when she had owned nothing and been no one. She did not give them up when she put on silk again. She kept them in the workbox in her own sitting room at the Abbey, beside the gold and the ivory tools a duchess is given, and on the long winter evenings she sometimes took the worn steel pair instead, and mended a cuff herself by the fire while Tristan read, the way she had mended cuffs in a fishing cottage when she had no name. He never asked her why. He understood the way he had always understood her without the asking, that a woman who has been no one keeps one small, honest tool to remember it by, and that the remembering is not grief, but a kind of gratitude for the cove, for the sharp, kind woman, for the long withdrawing tide that had carried her name back to her one stitch at a time. The candle burned down, the fire settled. Outside the leaded windows the November dark came up off the sea where it had always come from, and inside the warm room a duke read and a duchess sewed, and the small worn scissors caught the firelight, and the place in the chapel floor where the stones did not match held its peace under the snow that began, very softly, to fall.